Hi everyone, welcome to the show. Delighted to be able to do another one. I'm sorry it's been a few weeks since I've gone live on the YouTube channel. Busy with work, to be honest. But I had an idea for a show as well, which is why I'm doing this one, which is about algorithms. We talk so much about algorithms, how they sort of control the online world, social media, etc. And I sort of realized that I don't know actually that much about what it is and how it works. And I was hosting an event actually in Brussels about the EU's Digital Services Act. And during the lunch break, I met someone who was really interesting, who started to talk about his work on it. And we're going to hear from him. That's basically why I'm doing this show, is because he was saying really interesting things to me. And I thought, do you know what? This is a show that I'd like to do. So we're going to hear from him. His name is Jurriaan. I'll bring him in a second. We're also going to hear from some Brussels-based tech journalist people. Also some people that have some different opinions about algorithms and whether they should be exposed. And also we're going to hear from some sort of analysts and experts and a professor, etc. Essentially, normally at the beginning of these shows, I do a kind of rundown where I bring in the voices of the different politicians and stuff. But I didn't want it to be like that this time. I wanted it to be more just a real explanation of what's going on, how it works. And I am really ignorant on this. So this show may be a little bit messy from my point of view, because I'm just going to be asking questions about how this all works. So without further ado, I'm going to bring in Jurriaan Parie, who is from the NGO Algorithm Audit. This is the gentleman I was talking about. We had a nice lunch, one of those very Brussels stand-up, few lentils and a sandwich and a grapefruit juice, which you never drink at any other time apart from at those events. So thanks so much for being here, Jurriaan.
Hi, Jack. Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed lunch as well.
Yeah, it was a nice lunch, wasn't it? So let's break this down from the start. I'll ask you a bit more about your organization in a minute. But one of the things I want to do is to ask, what is an algorithm? What actually is it? A piece of code on a computer? Is it like an Excel spreadsheet? What does it look like, an algorithm?
The best analogy, I think, is a pie and then a recipe for making a pie in a digital way. So you're just following the step-by-step procedure, what to do with your data. Many different eggs, many different shapes, all in digital ways. And going through this procedure from collecting all ingredients, identifying how much you need from the one and the other, ultimately creates in an oven a pie. And that is getting from the data to the algorithm to the project you are using it for, because it's an all-purpose kind of technology, either content moderation or timeline feeds to risk prediction, etc. So you can apply it in many different ways, like a pie.
Okay, but if I want to create an algorithm for a social media website, is there like a computer program which I bring up, like Word or something like that, and then I start writing the algorithm? What are those programs?
Sure, but it's a level deeper than your Word application or your PowerPoint application. It goes one level deeper, where you are using a computer programming language, which is under the hood as well of Word or PowerPoint, where you can create the code lines yourself. It's called Python or R, many different forms, many different languages nowadays, many different ways of the materials to create your digital pie.
Do all of the big tech companies use different ones? Does Google use one? Does Meta have their own system for doing that? How does it work?
Well, there are some very broadly, universally accepted computer programming languages. One of those is Python, and it has been established, I believe, in Amsterdam during Christmas by a professor who was really into computer programming language, didn't like to celebrate Christmas with his family, and started to create a language all of himself around Christmas. His favorite series is Monty Python, like the English, what it means with the four people doing this show in the 80s or 90s, I believe. Monty Python, it was his favorite show. He named his computer programming language, which is now kind of ruling the world, after the Monty Python series, which is now adopted by Meta, Google, all over the world. You have some different forms, but this is a very popular one.
So when the algorithms that we talk about, that I think that are most interesting to people are, for instance, like, why am I seeing this post on my Instagram? Why is Google suggesting these things for me when I search on Google? Why is Twitter choosing these posts from people that I see? Are these social media websites essentially just their algorithms? Is that what backs them? And what looks different between, say, Facebook's algorithm and Twitter's algorithm? Can you explain what that kind of looks like and how the algorithm works?
Sure. And then I think on top of that, it's a cocktail. You have the users posting content, which is very essential for social media platforms as well. And then given these posts, you have this social network, which is your digital infrastructure, which can be linked to one another through an algorithm. So there you have like multiple components getting together, which makes this social media context so dynamic and vibrant and appealing to watch. It has a social dimension, it has a network dimension, it has an algorithm dimension.
So there's different algorithms. There's an algorithm for like what comes on the feed. There's an algorithm for the way I post something. There's a particular piece of code that decides how is that what I'm understanding there?
Well, yeah, the matchmaking between you and the network, that's done by an algorithm. So Jack posts something on the social media to promote his YouTube channel or his show, like we're doing now, and that is like feeded to people who, in general, like to watch YouTube channels. And there are certain incentives and matchmaking between user likes and preferences and the content available. And that over time is like a self-learning process that it gets into your preference zone, which creates some risks, but has some advantages as well.
What does that piece of code look like? So this is streaming on YouTube right now. YouTube is, I mean, I'm certainly not favored by algorithms on any of my social media. This isn't a video to complain about algorithms, but like, you know, how do they decide that, say, this video that's streaming on YouTube and Twitter and on LinkedIn, how do they decide that this is going to go into that feed? How does that work from the sort of main servers of a big social media company? The code picks something. What does it look like?
Yeah, it gets a little bit difficult, but in general, it's called learning to rank. So you want to rank things, isn't it? On your search engine result page on Google, in your feed, you're seeing in your application, it's ranking what's number 1, what's number 3, what's number 4, up to infinite, because that's your whole feed or your entire Google pages. Then it's based on feature extraction. So there are certain features related to a query you put in Google search engine. There are certain features connected to you as a user on a social media platform. On LinkedIn, for instance, how often you are checking your application, how often are you online, how much likes do you give to certain topics, all different kind of features. And feature extraction and learning which features have predictive value, it's really important task in general in statistical learning and specifically in learning to rank.
Okay, so do these algorithms, there's people changing them all the time, right? There's teams of people that tweak these algorithms and sit there. How do they decide to do that? So does Mark Zuckerberg sit in Facebook Meta Towers and go, Facebook needs to prioritize more cat videos, Instagram needs to prioritize more? Do you know what I'm obsessed with on Instagram? It's like people falling off surfboards, whatever. So that, like, the algorithm is giving that to me. But does it come from the top down, or do the algorithm masters just tweak small
Both.
pieces?
So it's a huge experiment. There are many different algorithms applied to many different communities, and then it's all measured and measured and measured and calculated what works best to increase ultimately the goal of the company, which is user engagement, and under the hood as well advertorials, which are like the main profit and business settings of these huge tech platforms which have huge market cap. So it's a combination of both user engagement and clicks, conversion rates, you can name it as well, but the profitability part.
Okay. I hope, I mean, this has made it a bit clearer for me. I sort of am starting to, I hope, I mean, this was the idea that we would set this up with this. Now, let's make it a bit EU focused, because you're basically, all of these algorithms are the trade secrets of these tech companies, right? They're hidden. Nobody knows what they are. They change all the time anyway. What is the EU trying to do? I mentioned we met at this Digital Services Act, but there are many different things. The AI Act, the Digital Markets Act. I really don't want this to be a sort of forensic thing of the names. We just forget about all the names. What are the institutions in Brussels trying to do? How are they trying to get the algorithms exposed?
The most important thing is that there is somebody watching with the tech companies what they are doing under the hood. Because now it's an entire era over the past 20 years of self-regulation, where there are certain market failures, you can say, profit over safety, more user engagement and ad profit against the risk of fake news spreadings during the 2016 elections in the US, Brexit, etc. So the aim is of the EU institutions to have some regulation in place, to ask out what are the trade-offs these companies make between profitability and safety, for instance.
So, but what are they trying to do there? They're putting in laws that will force the companies to tell them about the algorithm, right?
Exactly. So an example is Article 37 of the Digital Services Act, which mandates that very large online platforms and search
That's
engines,
Google and Meta and stuff like that. That's not a
there are
small...
the very big ones you all like are familiar for you, are obligated to have their AI systems, which is company specific. Can be a recommender system for ads. It can be Google Maps showing you the way. It can be Wikipedia showing you content. To have their AI systems obligated to like an independent third-party audit.
What's that? What's an independent third-party audit? So another company like yours, right? Algorithm audit. This is what you're suggesting, or you're suggesting the governance of it.
So it's a market controls market basis, which is the strategy of the EU clearly, that there are big companies like now in accounting, Big Four, the whole private auditor industry, looking at the AI systems of other tech companies, which is the case in medicine, in aviation, in food regulation, in finance as well, that algorithms go live. And before they are going live, they are checked by an independent third party on risks and regulations. And now that whole past era of regulation in those other disciplines is unfolded into the digital realm.
So auditors, in my mind, are like KPMG, Deloitte, Ernst & Young, EY or whatever. So they will go into Google, they will look at the algorithm, and they will decide if it's the right thing to fit into the laws that the EU has set.
That's where the tricky part gets in, because nobody knows yet what exactly will be audited for. And that's now what if you read the reactions of the private auditors on this piece of legislation, the Digital Services Act, there's a very worrisome private auditor saying, we have to audit, but we don't know what to do. Give us criteria, give us standards.
So let me stop you just from a basic point of view. If you get a financial audit, right? If they go into a bank, these auditors, they have to check that the right money went out, the right tax was paid, the right business expenses, etc. But right now, what they're saying is that they won't be able to go into the Facebooks and Googles of the world and say, because they don't know what they're looking for. They don't know whether they are meant to be finding out that, right, they're doing too much advertising towards children, or right, they're doing too much. Is that what you're saying? That there's no specification by the EU?
And my idea is that it's the deliberate strategy of the European Commission just to put these private parties, find it out yourself. We are collecting the results of your investigative research at the tech companies. We will look into all audit reports, and over time, in this collective learning process, we will develop together the best standards for this specific technology.
So they're waiting for the results of the audit and the information they find before they decide what they're actually looking for.
Exactly. Like public sector, it's like you could say, understaffed, not the most technical, nerdy minds working in public policy. How should they come up with the right standards for those very specific, highly technical Googles, Metas, Instagrams, whatever? So it's just a way of imposing rules for other parties to come up with the specific rules, which is, I think, a very elegant way how a public sector or government could act in this very complicated field of digital regulation.
So that's why you started your NGO, Algorithm Audit. Tell us, what are you doing? You're trying to, what made you start it? What was the point?
We are an independent AI bias testing platform, as well for other normative standards. So we say it's not really, from a societal perspective, desirable that only the private auditors are debating what the standards will be for the future. There should be a party from societal point of view, a civil society organization, debating as well what is fair in specific context. What is non-discrimination? What is transparency? What is society large wanted to be released about the algorithm shaping our societies and democracies?
So you're representing sort of users, all of us, civil society organizations. I'm not in any way sort of doing. It's such a Brussels thing that we say, like, what does that mean? It means people using it. You want to represent everybody who's on the platforms.
Exactly, because ultimately we say, especially topics related to fairness and justice, that's not up to a private party to decide what it is. So we say fairness cannot be privatized. We are not wanting to have like courts and judges to be privatized. So for the future where fairness is coded in those algorithms in some way, we say that should be decided upon from a public perspective rather than from the big private auditors, which are now engaging through this Digital Services Act with the big tech platforms.
Okay, so are you in favor of the algorithms of the big tech companies being made entirely public so that we can all understand what they mean? Would we be able to understand them? How would we get that information?
Not necessarily, but there should be certain checks and balances. Like in the medical sector with the vaccine campaign around COVID, there are very smart people developing those amazing vaccines which helped us from the pandemic. At the same time, they have to be checked by a European Medicine Agency before such a vaccine campaign gets live and gets scaled across entire populations. So that's what we are trying to do as well by creating algo prudence. That's a case-based
What's that?
approach.
What does algo prudence mean?
It's a combination of the algorithm and the jurisprudence part. So you have jurisprudence about like the domain of law and ethics. What is the right thing to do? And we've been thinking for this already over, I don't know how many 100 years. We came up with a legal system with all different kind of branches and parts of law, but it's a case-by-case approach. It's very context specific. That's what we want to apply for algorithms as well. For this specific algorithm, what's the best thing to do? That's a very difficult question. So you have to look at it at a case-by-case basis. And that's why we are then convening, as a civil society organizations, these audit commissions with diverse people from a pluralistic view, having this more democratic debate. What, in this specific situation, what variables should be included, for instance, in this recommender system? Are all features desirable to be included? For instance, your zip code, your battery level, when Uber is differentiating the price for your rail hiding service.
So they could put the price up if your battery is low, you mean?
For instance, and that's now, it's just
Do we know if Uber does that?
No, well, it's difficult, and I know there's been a lot of research into this specific case of this specific company, and that turns out to be very, very difficult to say and make those claims. So that's what I'm not doing at the moment.
Not yet.
No, we had some trouble with that in the past. So there are these are topics which should be decided upon not only from a private perspective, because then you have the profit over safety, but as well from a societal perspective. And that's what we are doing with this algo prudence.
Yeah, amazing. Jurriaan, stay with me. I'm going to bring in Eliska Pirkova, who's from Access Now, which is another NGO which represents this kind of issue and talks about this kind of stuff as well. And I know you're an expert on this, Eliska. It's great to have you with us. Thanks for joining.
Thank you very much for having me. Great pleasure to be here.
So you've heard what Jurriaan's been saying then. You guys are in favor of algorithms being much more transparent, for us having much more information about them, right?
Absolutely. And when we speak about the transparency, and I think many civil societies underline this argument already during negotiations of the DSA, we do not see it like a silver bullet of, this panacea solution to all issues, but meaningful transparency, which is also tiered transparency. So information that I, as a user, need to know in order to understand how my content is being distributed or moderated, and other information that might be more relevant for regulators or then independent stakeholders who, for instance, can then monitor and audit algorithms. That's the approach to transparency we defended. Yes, correct.
Yeah, the thing in this instance, though, does transparency it's an interesting word. It's an important word. We want to know what's happening. But if you send me Google's code for its search engine, I'm not going to be able to understand what that means, am I?
Well, probably as an everyday user, no, you won't be able to understand that. But then the question is, what is that level of explainability and understanding of how algorithms work and influence your experience as a user, and how to establish that necessity threshold for you as a user, what information you necessarily need to receive. And that means that we also need to ensure that whatever transparency we achieve under the DSA, and we have lots of meaningful criteria that for the first time are being legally binding for platforms, that this transparency is truly useful and understandable. And that's why even in the DSA, we can see several layers of transparency depending on what actor within the, the regulatory DSA framework will be receiving those information and what they are going to be used for.
Can you explain why the tech companies are unhappy about these laws? Why haven't they in the past just said, here's our algorithm? Why is it so important to them?
Yeah, so I think in the past, there were always some level of transparency reports, or not always, but a couple of years ago, companies started to voluntarily commit to some transparency criteria. But of course, the way how they moderate or curate user-generated content also lies in the core of their business model. And while there might be few security concerns around disclosing too many information that could be to some extent justified, many of those secrets, are probably also protected due to that profit-driven business model. All these algorithms are, of course, using our data, depending on the type of the algorithm, how these data are being processed. And unpacking them in such detail ultimately may endanger the business model that, these platforms actually depend upon.
Exactly, Jurriaan. This is kind of like what you were saying. With Uber sort of switching, like we're not alleging that they do this because we don't know the algorithm, but the secrecy around it suggests that there are nefarious things going on in these algorithms. No, I mean that's always the sense. I see posts on Instagram all the time. Oh, the algorithm's got me. The phone is listening to me. Would it not be better for the tech companies to come clean? We would trust them more where there's a big lack of trust, right?
True.
Jurriaan, that was for you. Yeah.
I fully agree. The difficult thing is that as well, like Europe, it is a market-oriented society, isn't it? We like innovation. We like new businesses arising. We are unhappy that there are not like big EU-based social media firms. So there's a very fundamental tension between this innovative part and the way how we want to structure our market economies. From a personal perspective, I think governments as well, for instance, have a role to play here to be much more transparent in the first place, to get like their cards more open on the table, what they are doing, what kind of profiling is used. So
government algorithms, you mean? So explain that. What's a government algorithm?
For instance, for public services like social welfare, it's
on their website, you mean, or just the way that they process it in their systems?
If you are in need for money and you are like unemployed, you can rely on social welfare in a lot of countries. That can only be done, people say, when it's like there's a healthy way of keeping this system into place, and therefore there should be kind of re-examination what people potentially are like unduly granted these social welfare benefits. And their risk profiling gets into the picture, for which increasingly algorithms are used. Then profiling, it's not only done by like human analysts, but as well like these criteria and threshold values, which zip codes to select, which age categories to collect, which kind of literacy rate to investigate, increasingly determined by algorithms. And there you see there's a lot of setback and backlash now in the Netherlands about potentially discriminatory and also proven historically biased data sets used for these purposes, which is very troublesome.
But those algorithms are not going to come in under this EU law, right? They are not very big platforms. The Dutch government isn't considered a very big platform. So will they need to be audited too?
Not the Digital Services Act, but the EU AI Act will have quite far-reaching obligations for a lot of governmental and public sector organizations, including law enforcement like police organizations.
Interesting. So, Eliska, how's this gonna affect us? Like, surely if we're in a world where all of the algorithms are sort of exposed, that's going to change a lot of things, though. No, that's going to make it. Is it going to affect our user? What are the reactions from the tech companies going to be? They're going to try and find other ways around this so that they can. I don't know. What does that world look like once we know about the algorithms?
Well, I think one important issue to also mention why companies are maybe so hesitant to disclose information about their algorithms is that they ultimately often do not work. And they do have a negative far-reaching consequences for people's rights. And we especially see this in the countries of global majority, where, for instance, in case of automated content moderation, we do know that platforms invest much less into languages spoken in the countries of global majority than in the bigger Western European or Western markets in general.
But by that, you're saying India and China, etc. It's all those countries don't get things in their
absolutely
languages.
Or also
in China, you can't get on Twitter and stuff. So why would they do that?
Well, I mean, okay, China is a very particular example, given that, of course, it's a country that, overall, we cannot really speak about free flow or access to information. It's a very restrictive regime that uses also strict liability for platforms or even criminal liability for individual staffers that operate in the market. Many platforms do not operate there. So, but if you even look at the countries where, Arabic countries, for instance, we see exactly the same issues there. We see that content is often being unjustifiably restricted due to the public pressure of the government, and governments are indeed not exactly transparent about how they are pressuring these platforms to comply with their own political agenda. And also in more notorious examples, such as, for instance, Myanmar, where the content moderation ultimately failed, and there were a number of other negligence that the platforms committed, which resulted into disastrous consequences, especially for vulnerable and marginalized groups. How that world will look like once the DSA is fully enforced, well, I would like to believe that the situation will improve, especially for those who fall into the jurisdiction of the European Union. Of course, transparency as such won't be enough, but we have other important elements such as due diligence obligations for very large online platforms. Some of them already have been discussed. I would also add to audits the importance of the risk assessment measures. That is sort of a pre-step before platforms will actually subject themselves to that third-party auditing, where we also have now specifically mentioned the negative effect to fundamental rights, for instance. And that's a huge progress, because we truly now want to regulate algorithms instead of concrete categories of illegal content. That has proved to be a very short-sighted and absolutely not effective way how to regulate platforms and achieve their accountability.
Yeah, you've touched on something deeper there, because it's not just like, I want less dog videos on my Instagram feed. Is actually a manipulation of the society as well. Now, I'm going to bring in, this is the first time I've ever had 4 people all on the screens. I'm very excited about it on the show. I'm going to bring in You're going to get going. All right. Thanks, Jurriaan. I really appreciate you being on the show today. Thank you so much. See you soon. Appreciate everything that you've done. So I'm going to bring in Jennifer Baker, a good friend of mine who's on holiday and is taking time out of her holiday to speak. Jen, you've heard a little bit about what we've been saying there. The tech companies are resistant to this, but as we heard from Eliska, like these algorithms manipulate the information that people get.
I mean, yes and no. I mean, certainly they're resistant to it in the sense that they're, in a general sense, resistant to most regulation that they fear might stifle their freedom to innovate certain ways in the future. And there's an ongoing battle about what data can be used for what and what constitutes a legitimate use of data. And one of the interesting things, actually, that we're seeing recently is that certain big companies, that's currently it's Meta, trying to argue that this is the service they're offering. So they can use this, that the service they offer isn't a social media platform on Facebook is a specific case. It's actually that they are using algorithms to target ads. And so that's been a way to get around other privacy laws about what data they can use. Now that's just being chucked out by the courts, but it's an interesting argument. They were trying to rely on this as, you're not just using social media, you're getting, this is wonderful social media with algorithms. So it's also part of their offering. And many big companies are going to be very tightly adherent to that.
What would social media look like without algorithms? That's a weird question to ask, but I'm like I say, I'm really like completely like ignorant of how this works. Would it work if there were no algorithms?
Well, you can time travel, if you can travel back in time and remember what it was like when it was first set up. I mean, this is true. I mean, there were different, more organic timelines. It was just what happened in terms of what was next, and it was all by, filtered by time. I mean, the algorithms, and everyone, as we know, as social media users, gets very upset once an algorithm is tweaked a little bit. He's outcrying and Twitter changes a little bit of this or Facebook changes a little bit of that. And those are just those are the techies tweaking the algorithms in a way to try and deliver more sticky content. So yeah, you could have social media without algorithms, and if you're old enough to remember, Jack.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you, did MySpace have an algorithm? Surely there was, or was that just? It was much more rudimentary, wasn't it? It was just individual profiles, and you had to kind of go and find them. There wasn't feeds, so.
It was more rudimentary. I think what's been a big game changer and a big shift is partly where data is gathered from, and partly the, if you like, the merging of data, the consolidation of data. So you've got big companies, you've got Meta, you've got Alphabet, who can then track across their different resources. So they can link WhatsApp and Instagram and all that data together. So you actually end up with a more sophisticated data set. And the more sophisticated the data set, the more an algorithm can do with it. Whether you want that or not, and under EU law, there are efforts made to try and untie these. I mean, there was a competition case that comes under competition law. I know we were talking earlier about DSA and other laws, but under competition law, there's questions about whether data is sharing or data sort of conglomeration or accumulation in one space is actually a dominant position issue. So, of course, companies' argument that no, we're not dominant in this area and we can bring our data sets together, or we will have all the data, but we will never merge them. I mean, the more they're pushed to deliver to their shareholders, of course, the more chance there is of them bending the rules or coming up with new and creative legal loopholes to allow them to do that.
Yeah, exactly. It's about money. Listen, if I can ask you both to hang around, I don't know if you've got time. I hope you can, but I've also I've pre-recorded some interviews that I'm going to play out for now. And so really appreciate if you can hang around and we can bring you back in. The first one is Alexandra Cernian. She's a good friend. She is a good friend of mine, and she's a professor at the Polytechnic University in Bucharest. And I asked her about what machine learning is. She was talking about the algorithms and how they play into the way that computers feed us things and how the computers learn. She's also an expert in blockchain. So I'll play that interview out and you'll see some more stupid questions from me.
Machine learning is a methodology, let's say, but basically it incorporates different types of concepts and algorithms, and a lot of mathematics behind, and these algorithms will in the end understand how to process different types of data. For example, if you want to teach a computer how to identify a cat in some pictures, what you need to do first is to provide the algorithm with lots and lots of pictures with cats, which are labeled, and you show look to the computer, look, this is a cat, this is a cat, this is a cat, this is a cat, and so on. This is not a cat, this is not a cat. And in the end, after you
This is
that,
a cat. I love it.
and in the end, after you do that like a couple of hundreds or thousand times, the machine will, or the algorithm will, in the end, know how to differentiate a cat in a picture. And
How
the
does
more
the
you train it,
algorithm know that, though?
based on how you train it. It's all in how you train it. So it's all in the human expert that trains the algorithm. You need to label those pictures so that the algorithm looks for that label, and then each algorithm will have different ways of processing the information, and this is all in what you are programming it to do. So it doesn't do things just like crazy by itself. So in the end, this is how it learns. It looks at what the expert is labeling on the pictures, processes it with different methodologies, and then understands how it needs to provide the final decision that this is or this is not a cat.
So you also work on blockchain, and
Yeah.
that is used for cryptocurrencies. That is a whole show on itself, trying to explain what blockchain is. But a lot of these, the word algorithm has this kind of sinister connotation in public life, that the algorithms are controlling us. Are they? What's your impression of that? How do blockchains and especially the crypto companies, or the other way in which blockchains are used, are they created perhaps in a cynical way?
Well, as an expert in the field, I don't think that they are controlling us, because I know that the algorithms only do what other experts train them to do. So the machine will not have a conscience, will not decide on things that it was not somehow trained to decide on. For example, if you want an algorithm or a machine to say that to discriminate in any way, that would mean that previously someone trained the machine on a data set which was discriminating, and then this is what it learns, just like you're educating a child in the end.
Do that though. There are sinister forces in the world. The accusation is that the social media companies and stuff keep us hooked by doing those things.
Unfortunately, there are such cases, and we have seen it, and we've probably experimented different such situations, especially in social media and in media in general, especially with the whole generative AI thing that is buzzing around at the moment.
What's that?
But it's not, I mean, the main idea that I would want to send out to people is that the machine doesn't do that by itself without being somehow trained to do that. Like a drone will not attack the owner just because all of a sudden it decides to do that without previously haven't been told that is what it should do. It's just like educating a child in the end. If you teach the child to throw the papers on the street, this is what he will do. If you teach him to be disciplined, this is what he will do. It's kind of the same with the algorithms. The people who are developing the algorithms are responsible and accountable for the outcomes that the algorithm will provide. Now, the problem is that we don't have regulations that specify that. And this is why we still see situations like this, where a machine decides that it should say that it's wrong to have a specific color, skin color, for example, or that a drone should attack a person. And then we read all those news and articles that say, okay, the machines have gone crazy, and so on.
This is it. So this is what the EU is trying to do, though, is to get clarity on the algorithms, especially of the big tech companies.
Yes.
Are you in favor of this? I mean, this whole show is about me not having a clue how algorithms work and trying to speak to people like you who do to find out a bit more about it. So say the Digital Services Act of the European Union gives us lots more information about the algorithm. I'm probably not going to be able to understand it, am I? And how? I mean, is it a good thing, in your opinion? What will we?
I totally support it, and I think it's very important to have such regulations at the moment. You've seen how everything exploded around AI with the Chat GPT and with generative AI, like those applications that you can use. You can provide them text, and then they generate images, and you can get different types of crazy images, like with Donald Trump being arrested and so on. That was viral on the internet. So
I got just yesterday a video was circulating of me being deepfaked from when I was presenting.
So, you see,
Crazy.
this is one of the downsides of the technology, because, you know, on the one hand, we have this huge progress that technology can bring us if we use it in a favorable way to humanity. But on the other hand, we have all these problems that it can generate, like deep fake news, which can, you know, socially speaking, they can generate quite big problems, and they can influence the political decisions, they can influence election results, and so on. And this is not, I mean, this is not a new concept right now, but I think that with this generative AI and with a more general artificial intelligence like ChatGPT, we could get into more trouble with that unless we regulate that very specifically. So yes, I'm totally in favor of such regulations. Besides the DSA, there is also the AI Act that the European Parliament has just voted, and that will specifically regulate how artificial intelligence is being developed and used by people. So that means that also the technologies that are developing AI systems will be held accountable for what they provide to the public. Will need to be very transparent in terms of how they are developing their systems, what data they use, because as I said, for AI, when we talk about these types of machines and these type of systems like AI based, the data set that we use to train the system is very important. Like if we use a correct data set with objective information, then we will get an objective outcome. If we are training it on subjective data set, the outcome will also be influenced. So everything stands in the input that we provide in the very beginning. So one of the problems is that now we don't know how these algorithms are trained. You just get like a black box. You get an application in which you provide an text and you get a picture, but you have no clue about what's going on inside this black box. So
we're not gonna, but am I going to be able to understand it if they give me the black box? I mean, people aren't going to be able to, if they give me the key, I still won't get it, right?
No, probably not, but you will have...
Alexandra, come on, give me...
No,
right. You're right.
They will not tell you what's inside the box, but there will be some auditing that these companies will need to go through before they can release such an application. And during this audit, they will need to be very transparent and say, okay, this is the data that we use, this is how we develop the algorithm. They will not do that in a public way, but there will be probably some experts board there that will do these kinds of audit, so that the public will be sure that when they are using one of these AI systems, that they are in a good scope, let's say.
Yeah,
so this would be the purpose.
Yeah, we're gonna have to wait and see exactly, like, sort of how this information actually affects us and how we control it. Alexandra, thank you so much for joining the show.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you for inviting me.
There we go. So that was Alexandra Cernian. And I'm going to bring back in Eliska and Jennifer now. Perhaps, I mean, so Alexandra has got quite a positive attitude towards the laws. She thinks it's going to work. She thinks that it's all down to us training the algorithms and it's our fault if it goes wrong. Eliska, your reaction?
Well, if I speak on behalf of civil societies, we have always defended the Digital Services Act precisely because it's the second generation of content governance or platform accountability law that we have been pushing for and advocating for the longest time. But at the same time, I completely agree. And maybe that also connects us to your initial question about transparency, that machines itself, whether these are algorithms, automated decision-making processes, do not cause that societal harm or systemic risks in the DSA language on their own. And of course, it very much comes to the data sets that they are being trained on, and they are being trained by humans. And then there are different processes, and we also have to think about algorithms, even when it comes to content moderation or content recommender systems, that they work at the same time on the top of each other, happening in the background. So they are not separate individual processes that could maybe, or one could have that impression if you read the DSA, where you have one measure per, not necessarily per algorithm, but for instance, content recommender systems are being singled out more specifically by the DSA. And so I think especially access to those data, and not only for the regulators or for you as a user to understand, but data access framework in the DSA that we haven't mentioned yet. And it's one of the most innovative and novel elements within the law that will allow vetted researchers, people with the expertise, to understand how this algorithm operates and how they being trained.
Okay,
and it also
let's do it. Let's go there. A data access framework. What does that mean?
It means literally what it says. It's access to data.
But what does it mean? Like, there's what is a framework? There's a set of agreements where we all can go into a place and find out the specific data. What does it look like? What does it practically mean?
Well, if you could, Jack, but I think it's more about allowing teams of researchers and organizations and NGOs like Algorithm Watch and so on. They have access, and there's a sort of an obligation to turn over that information to those reputable organizations who can do that deep dive auditing. I don't think really, you or I want to go in and try and work out what's going on.
No, I'm
it's about
obsessed with
those
this,
with
aren't
the
I? I've got to give it
expertise
up.
who are independent, who can do that. And then it all comes back around to explainability to the lay user, which I think is very much more important.
So what does that look like? How's it, what's in the law? What's the deal then? What are the fights over this ability to access particular bits of data, and what are the forces on that? Eliska, yeah.
So first of all, I think one important element within the data access framework measure is that, of course, not everyone will be able to access those data. There will be a vetting system of researchers and institutions that can access, and then also civil society organizations will have that ability too, which for us is, of course, the revolutionary measure. But that mechanism, how to really make this system operational and to also ensure that that system is secure and safe and it complies with data protection safeguards, that is currently in the process of making. But this level of information goes actually, or it's that extra layer of transparency where, we've always been pushing for evidence-based and research-based policymaking. And this measure is exactly the tool that will enable us to hopefully achieve the understanding what is actually happening on those platforms. What is the causal link between incitement to violence online or online hate speech and the real world harm, which is the term platforms often use also in their terms and conditions. And that's a big deal because to this day, we do think that this is happening. Civil societies like us often have to rely on different plugins, data scraping, or voluntary donation of data, so we can actually conduct the research and prove certain societal phenomena or a negative impact of algorithms on mental well-being of teenagers or society in general. And that also has certain very negative consequences for us when we are being directly threatened by legal actions from very large online platforms. And there are several examples concerning Algorithm Watch that has already been mentioned, or even very known worldwide recognized universities.
So who is threatening those legal actions? The big tech firms, because they think that you're getting access to their information that they don't want you to have.
Yes, and at the same time, they say that we are actually violating their policies precisely by obtaining this information that we were not actually authorized or entitled to get at first place. Indeed.
Where do you get it from?
So there are different research projects. That usually consist of some plugins that you can actually use voluntarily. There are agreements then made with those individual users and groups that voluntarily donate those data. And so this way you can actually observe how users' behavior is being impacted and influenced by these algorithms. You can see whether certain features that the user chooses to use on the platform, for instance, you don't want to be targeted by certain content, whether those measures can truly protect you. And there is an excellent study done by an organization called Panopticon, and the study is titled Algorithms of Trauma, where they do exactly that. And they also show how even if platform launches certain, let's say, protective features, after some time we see that the algorithms falls to the same patterns and the harm is being again intensified.
Yeah. So Jen, this stuff that Eliska is talking about there, we sort of one of the interesting things that's happening is that the tech companies are sort of portraying them as trade secrets. We're a normal company. They're fighting this, perhaps not so publicly. What's your assessment? I mean, because they're big US tech companies, right? What's your assessment of the optics of this and how it's going to play out?
Well, I think, to be honest, true to form, like a lot of EU legislation, I personally think the DSA rather is on the right track. I think its aims are laudable. I think also the AI Act with its risk-based approach is also pretty good. But where it falls down and where everything will always get stuck is in the implementation and the enforcement. I mean, we already have a lot of laws on the books which around data, for example, the General Data Protection Regulation, which does give you in that already the right not to have serious decisions that may impact your life made by machine without a human in the loop. We already have the right. So if there's algorithms making decisions about whether you get a mortgage or not, or whether you get insurance or not, you already have the right under the GDPR to say, hang on, no, I want a human in the loop. So this is about allowing you to know when that happens. That's important. But it all comes down to enforcement. And we've seen a lot of GDPR enforcement problems. And I kind of think we're going to see a lot of that wrangling around what is and isn't going to be allowed in terms of access. There's going to be, I know, pushback on what organizations are being defined as very large platforms in terms of they'll try to market split. So they'll say we're maybe very large in this area, but maybe not in another. So I think it all comes down to implementation, and we're going to see a lot of stuff going through the courts. I think that's an inevitability. But as I mentioned with the AI Act, which is risk-based, I do think that's the right approach, because at the end of the day, Jack, you and I don't need to know what's going on in the black box. What we need to have is trust and faith that nothing nefarious is going on, that there's nothing unethical happening, that our data isn't being used for things we don't want it to be used for. I'm always hesitant to say that we should try and force technological solutions on cultural problems. And I think here it's the same sort of thing. We don't want to make the tech the problem if our real problem is that we have big issues in culture regarding elections. So, you know, an algorithm might advise me that you need to wear lipstick number 43 today. That's one thing. I can be missold a lipstick, but it's another thing if I'm missold a president. I say this all the time. There are issues that we really need to care about, that the tech isn't always the problem and it isn't always the solution.
I love it. Missold a lipstick or a president. Well, it's true. Like, we don't know how a plane. I don't really understand how a plane flies, but I get on one because I trust it.
Exactly.
So if you guys can hang on, there's actually someone else I spoke to who's not so in favor of hearing about of the algorithms being exposed. Just stand by for a second if you can. If you need to drop off, that's fine. But can you both hang around for a few more minutes?
Yeah.
Perfect. Sure. Okay, so stay with me. I'm going to bring in Daniel Castro. I spoke to him earlier this morning. He is the director of the Center for Data Innovation. Has a slightly different perspective. So take a listen to what he had to say. There's this sense among the Europeans, especially the EU institutions, that getting the information on how algorithms work is good for us, good for citizens, good for people. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, transparency is always useful, right? Transparency is one way that people, understand things, one way that they trust things. But there's also limits to that. When we're talking about some of the machine learning algorithms that are out there, that I think a lot of this transparency requirements are intended to address. There's only so much you can do, right, to understand what's actually happening behind the scenes. And what we've seen is that I think oftentimes what's more important for consumers is accuracy, right? You want to know over time that something is consistently accurate, and that's why you trust it, not because somebody told you this is what's happening behind the scenes. And in fact, there's been some really interesting research that shows that when a prediction is accurate from an algorithm, but it doesn't align with what you expect, that even if you have an explanation or transparency there, you might not still believe it. And so, there's really limits, as I said, to what transparency can achieve. And I think, in most cases, what we really care about is accuracy and consistency.
Do you not think that we're maybe a bit too far gone, though, that there's such a lack of trust? I mean, here in Europe, obviously, we have this sense that the American big tech companies own all our data, are controlling the way our news is being led. Do you think that just full transparency and accuracy, full transparency rather than accuracy, may be the way to do it? I mean, the big tech companies are fighting this. They don't want to give away what they see as their secrets, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the context. If you look at, some of the transparency efforts by big tech, I mean, they've done things like, Meta has created a, ad transparency, system where you can see all the ads that are being run and who's paid for them. You look at, Google, for example, and they've added a lot of transparency around takedown requests, so you know exactly what governments are requesting for taking down sites or requesting access to data. So there's, a lot of the companies have done a lot to increase transparency overall. But I think where most of the companies are hesitant is around transparency in ways that either reveal trade secrets or allow people to kind of game or cheat the system. So for example, if you think about the search algorithm, Google hasn't ever disclosed all the details of its search algorithm, and it repeatedly and consistently changes its algorithm over time. One of the reasons it doesn't disclose this is because they know that if they told everyone this is how we exactly rank things, the people start gaming the system, and they do that today already. They'll put in fake links. They'll do all sorts of things that are designed to promote maybe one company over another that doesn't necessarily reflect what actually is the best site or the most popular site or the site consumers are looking for. I think that's where we have to recognize that there needs to be a balance. Full transparency might not be what's best for consumers, again, because of cheating or because of other factors that can come into play.
Can you envisage a world where all of the algorithms are fully exposed and we know all of it? Do you think that could ever happen? I mean, there's so much pressure and change, and with AI, machine learning, there's all of this stuff that's going on. Do you think that there's a way in which we may one day know everything about all of the algorithms?
Well, I think there's two ways of looking at that. I mean, one, we can certainly see a world where there's more, open source algorithms and models, and we're using those, and so people can run them and test them on their own. And that's one level of transparency. Although, if you have more of these open models, that actually creates other problems if you're trying to regulate them, if you're trying to restrict who can get access to them, which we've seen a lot of policymakers calling for. But the other challenge, and the other way that I think, particularly as we move into AI systems, the transparency doesn't work the way maybe it worked in the past, where you had very finite algorithms, that had limits on what they were doing. Transparency there meant you could pretty much understand, all of the possible outcomes in some limited circumstances. But you look at these new large language models or other models that have billions of parameters. You can't really look at those and say, well, I'm going to look at all the possible outputs and evaluate those. I mean, that'd be like, looking for a new hire, someone that you're going to employ, and say, before I hire you, I want you to first tell me every possible answer you might give to any question I might ask you in the future. That's not possible, right? That's not possible for a person to do. That's not possible, or for an algorithm to do. You can't see all possible outcomes. I think that's where, again, it shows the limits of transparency. It doesn't mean that the reasons for transparency go away. I mean, we want transparency because we want to have confidence that these systems are accurate, that they're not biased, that they're safe. And so we need to look at other measures as well that can help get us there and provide that confidence. But yeah, I think there's just limits to transparency.
But if we don't regulate, then the power stays with the big tech companies, with the Twitters, with the Googles, with the Metas, and we just never, you know, they then hold all the cards, all the power. No.
Well, I'm not saying don't regulate. I'm just saying that, you know, regulating through transparency isn't necessarily the solution. I think looking at outcomes is actually,
what kind of regulation would you endorse or suggest?
So I would say look at outcomes. In most cases, what we care about are outcomes. So whether it's, you know, an algorithm that has hiring bias, or if you're looking at autonomous vehicles, you look at, you know, crash and accidents. There's, I think, an effort right now in the OECD to create an AI incidents database, where in theory we can start tracking when things go wrong and better understand it, so we have good data about where there are problems and where to address them. I think that's the best way to get to you know, solving these issues, because what we might find is that, you know, the way to fix it is to create a better algorithm. We also might find that the way to fix it is to create more oversight or create other types of mitigation measures, and that's what we don't know yet. And I think, you know, tracking that and responding to that in real time will be more effective than trying to put some you know, preemptive regulations on what you have to do before you can bring a product to market.
Daniel, thank you so much for joining the show.
Yeah, happy to be here, Jack.
Jack, you're on mute.
Yeah, and I'm also out of focus. My camera battery just bit of a tech nightmare. Jennifer, I know you want to pick up on some of the things.
I mean, well, honestly, I wish Daniel was here in person, because then you'd have a real battle on your hands. It sounds like he and I are saying the same thing, because I focused on outcomes, but they could not be more far from the truth. I think he's creating absolutely false dichotomies and putting up straw men and tearing them down. The analogy of an employee giving every particular answer is just ridiculous and not at all relevant to how we want to see regulation on algorithms.
I wish we could have him here to respond. He just couldn't make it. So
I know.
He was kind to give us the time, but yeah.
It's also worth pointing out, I said you can't have regulation before bringing a product to market, which you absolutely obviously do in so many other areas. You can't just put unsafe food products or toys or anything on the market. There's all sorts of regulation there before you can bring something to market. So this is, you know, you don't get a free pass just because your particular product happens to be involving algorithms. So, you know, I mean, and I like, you know, transparency is great, but, you know, maybe he's a little bit selective in where we want to see that transparency. I mean, I also think following the money is an important thing to do, so you can see from that perspective who's driving and what, and who's making what arguments for what people. So I do think that, although it sounds maybe like Daniel and I are saying the same thing, which is focus on the outcomes, that's not the same thing as saying just have a free for all.
Yeah, Eliska, I know you've got to go, so I just perhaps if there's something you want to pick up on before you head off.
Yeah, just maybe very quickly, also based on Daniel's contribution, I feel like that sometimes it's precisely how Jennifer put it into such a strange dichotomies that are not exactly helpful. No one is saying, of course, that there is no need for content moderation or content curation, quite the opposite. But once the algorithms, especially if they are being designed under the secrecy by the very large online platforms that have significant impact on public discourse, and they often have the final word about how our rights are going to be respected and protected in the online ecosystem, then there comes some obligations, or those due diligence obligations that they simply have to follow. And one of it is either meaningful transparency and also enabling other user empowering tools as a part of that option, how your content is being curated, so you actually have that choice. And it touches even upon the issues how, you know, then the whole entire interface of platforms is being designed. That's also something we haven't mentioned yet. It's not directly connected to the issue of automated decision-making processes, but it's equally relevant and important. So no, less
like
transparency.
the design of the website. So if there's a list down the side here that's kind of nice looking, but we focus on the main one as the way that we look at the algorithm.
Exactly.
But actually, this side one's doing all the legwork of giving us the other information.
We call it dark patterns, Jack. Dark patterns.
Exactly. So you end up actually, you know, consenting to something you actually don't even have idea what exactly you are giving your agreement to. So
It's
That's
a whole
just
other show.
an example.
Yeah, no, but we're going to touch on that. Eliska, I know you've got to run, so thank you so much
do.
for joining the show today. Just to say, this streams on Twitter and on YouTube, and everyone can write comments and have a discussion about this further. Perhaps Daniel, I know you guys have both sort of criticized his point of view. Maybe he'll want to come back and reply on Twitter as well. So thank you so much, Eliska. It's been great talking. Thanks for joining.
Likewise. Have a good day. Bye.
Bye. So dark patterns, mate.
Yep.
Go on.
With patterns, they're exactly what you say. It's
But
when
they're
you're
done by an algorithm.
there's sometimes somebody they've got very sophisticated psychoanalysts there helping us work out that your eyes will always look on that part of the screen and you will be drawn to blue rather than black. I mean, those will be tested through algorithms, I guess, and then they will be implemented. But the dark patterns is where you're pushed into or nudged into sharing more than you possibly might want to. It's making it 4 clicks to sort of disengage from something versus 1 click to just say yes. I mean, we all do it. The biggest lie on the internet is I have read the terms and conditions.
Yeah, never. So do you just this show it's been a bit messy, I think, as far as the content wise, but I always knew it was going to be like that because I started with, is this a bloody Excel sheet and this is how it's working? And we had the explanations significantly more complicated than that. And we've got political. The big tech firms, Jen, like what tools do they have to prevent exposing the algorithms, which they don't want to do?
Well, apart from armies of lawyers and very deep pockets,
Right.
assuming the DSA comes in, it's also a question of where they're located. Can you reach to them? In some cases, I don't think it's the big tech ones. If we're talking about, for example, disinformation, I actually don't think necessarily it's the big tech that we all know and love or know and hate that we need to worry about, because they will in the end of it try to be compliant, or at least try to put a veneer of compliance on things. It's probably those slightly dodgy Gab or whatever, slightly underground sort of social media networks that are hosted in or 4chan or something, hosted in somewhere in, I don't know, Manila is usually the place,
wasn't it?
Yeah,
but
which you can't really get to, and it's
but
very
they're not the very
whack-a-mole.
big platforms that are coming under
not.
those audits. So,
They're not, and they're not the ones that, I mean, it depends on your perspective. I mean, those are the ones that give me pause, because I feel those are the ones that are, to my concern, sort of spreading the most egregious and, political and anti-democratic disinformation. Whether they're mainstream enough that they're hitting most people, possibly not. But if those are the meme factories in Russia that are generating the stuff, again, none of them are going to be tackled by this. So in some respects, there's no real way to actually say on a global level we will have no more disinformation, regardless of the very laudable aims of the Digital Services Act. That's not going to happen. So I do think that the reality is we will see a lot of those very large platforms at least partially complying with the letter, if not necessarily the spirit of the law.
Yeah. I know we're going on a bit longer, but I do have some more questions that I want to ask. I think that you're going to be able to. I know you're more a journalist, so I know you're not the expert, but I love picking your brains on things like this, as you know. So,
just don't ask me to code.
Nice try. No, but the thing with these things is, and this was the same with GDPR, right? Which is the EU's data protection regulation, which was about exchanging data. The algorithms are a piece of intellectual property, right?
Yeah.
That rest mainly within US jurisdiction. The Europeans are trying to legislate on this, but that will only be about the way that this works in Europe.
Yeah.
But will that then mean that the algorithms change in the USA and around the world? Is that
well, you're exactly right in that the GDPR is the template for this. I mean, it's not fair to say that all algorithms are intellectual property. Some are open source, and some of them have open APIs and so on. And so, particularly when you talk about mobile phones and so on, there's a lot of stuff out there that's open source that we can allow the researchers and the developers to play around with. But in terms of those
open source, meaning people publish it.
Yeah. Meaning people publish it, developers can add to it. It's a collaborative work environment. You can take that piece of code and go off and make your own bit that works with it in your own little backyard or your own garage if you want. But it's about being more collaborative. I mean, open source is great. I mean, it really does lead to innovation. I mean, one of the big cries you often hear from people who don't want regulation is don't want regulation, is that regulation stifles innovation. I'd say actually, open source creates more innovation. So, there's an argument there.
Mastodon, the social media site that was the initial Twitter challenger, that was open source, but was rubbish.
Well, okay.
I'm sorry.
Sorry,
that is an opinion. Sorry, Mastodon, but I tried to get on it. I was like an early adopter. I was like, right, let's go. Yeah, let's get rid of Twitter. But it just hasn't, it just was clunky, and there was no real way of operating it, and that was to do with the algorithms and the code, right?
Well, you've actually touched on another thing, which is about the network effect that all these big companies have, and we're getting a little bit away. But the network effect is, when the more people use something, the more data the companies have to work with, on the more information to train their algorithms, and therefore the better algorithms they get. I mean, Google has some great engineers, or Alphabet as it is now, but it also has tons and tons of data because everybody uses it, and everybody uses it because its products are great. I mean, I might not always like the company, but its products are really good, and that's why people like me and others, even though we might have a pause when it comes to saying some of the terms and conditions, do use it. So you've got this vicious circle of, the big ones getting bigger and the small ones getting smaller. But you've asked me about GDPR and how that compares to how things operate. Yes, the EU is a bloc that wants to export its laws. It sees itself as a leader in this. With the GDPR, it has sort of worked because, it's about our market power in the EU with, the millions and millions of citizens that they want access to in the marketplace. It's often too much of a hassle to implement two different sets of working practices, be that legal or be that in terms of use of data. So yes, the big North American companies often just go along with what's happening in the EU, but they might not do that indefinitely if they consider it too onerous. We have heard, Facebook's going to pull out of Europe because X, Y, and Z. Well, last I checked, it's still up and running.
Finally. Okay, so this is to bring it into. It's really interesting what you're saying. The final thing I wanted to talk about. I don't know. I haven't seen you on it yet, but just to take this about the new thing, the threads. Are you on there yet?
I'm not, because I have very big privacy concerns about it.
Right.
It is the classic example of consolidating data. It's if you're on Instagram, you can just whoops it all across. I probably will go on it because of the network effects, but
this is it. So I joined it. I whacked on a VPN before when it was in America and put on an American VPN and downloaded it. And it's a really strange thing because it's the Instagram followers. The one thing I'm happy about is that they kept the Instagram blue tick on Threads. Very pleased. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Zuckerberg. But it doesn't. But it doesn't put. So the Instagram following that I have is very different, built from friends and connections and people that I've seen around and whatever, people that maybe have seen me on TV. Whereas Twitter is much more about it's a social media website that you build your following within it. That's actually the thing, is that most social medias, you build them within the frame of the platform itself. You don't get much crossover really, unless you're super famous, perhaps. So,
well, I don't know. I would say something like LinkedIn, for example, is built on real connections that you make in person.
Yeah, exactly. But that's it. So the Threads algorithm is going to come off the Instagram algorithm, right? Not the Twitter one, which makes it a very different thing. No?
Yeah, obviously they're different companies. They're in competition. Threads is there as a direct challenger to Twitter. So there's no way Elon Musk's going to go and say, here, have the data and compete with me. I think that's just not going to happen. I think the whole, as I say, bringing the Instagram thing is a way to try and give people a foot up so they don't feel like they have to build from scratch in building followers, because that can be feeling arduous. And you're going to think, oh gosh, not another channel. I think this is all about psychology and business sense, really, rather than anything to do with the algorithms. There's plenty of sophistication behind Threads, I am sure, already. Although I don't know whether the algorithm will drive all these American non-European users to someone called Brussels Geek anyway, so we will see.
Do you think that the algorithm will operate in the same way? I don't know. So we heard about Python that Jurriaan was talking about at the beginning. Will the algorithm for Twitter and Threads look quite similar, do you think? like in the way it's formatted? I don't know if you know about that.
I can't honestly say, but from what I'm hearing, probably not. But at the end of the day, there's only so many ways you can format short text and short messaging. It could be different colors, but at the end of the day, it's a sort of a written and photographic sharing medium, maybe with some videos and some interactivity and comments. You look at Reddit, how different is Reddit from the chat boards of 15 years ago? There really is a limited amount of what you can do until we get into the metaverse, and that's another story for another day.
Well, and also, I mean, the whole point in Threads is that the metaverse and all of that is completely fallen on its proverbial, right? That's why Zuckerberg's desperate to get in.
Yeah, my money wouldn't be on Zuckerberg developing the metaverse.
Interesting.
I've other thoughts. I've other horses I would back in that race if I was a betting mum.
Do you know what? Let's do another show. This is the thing. Whenever you do anything about tech, there's always like 100 different things that can come in. Jennifer, I know you professionally go by Jennifer, but because you're my friend, I call you Jen, and I apologize for doing that throughout this show. I love you. Go and have a lovely time on the rest of your holiday. Thanks for joining the show.
Thank you. I hope everyone's enjoyed our chat, and we'll do it again.
Cheers, mate. So that's really interesting. So this was super interesting for me, and I really hope that you guys have got something from it. Did you learn anything about how an algorithm works? I think I did. I think I understand a little bit more. I also sort of understand a bit more about what I don't know, how complex these things are, also how much they control our lives. I'm a social media animal. I'm always on my phone, and I'm just really aware. I watched a TED talk recently, which talked about the tech firms being the third superpower in the world after the US and China. And these algorithms are the things that control that. So I hope you found it interesting. Anyone, I know a lot more people actually watch this not live. So post your comments on YouTube, LinkedIn, or Twitter. Please like and subscribe to the video, to the channel. I'll be trying to go live as much as possible. Summer holidays coming up, but I'll try and keep up on the shows. And also send me messages, DM me if you have anything you want to talk about. Maybe if you want to watch me bungle my way through another topic like I have today. It's been great having you. Thanks for watching the show. Take a study.